Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, a couple of off, then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming key Professor Martin Schmalz. Martin Schmalz is one of the top thought leaders in the world. He is a professor of finance, economics, and real estate at the University of Oxford Saïd Business School. He previously served as Chief Economics and Director of the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, the regulator of audit firm. His experience spans corporate governance, management, corporate finance, asset pricing, accounting, auditing, strategy, and competitions. His research has been published in top-ranking journals. Now we will start our seminar with the Professor Martin Schmalz.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me, and apologies for the delay in starting. So this is joint work with Andrew Saïd, who's in the audience, and various other authors, Amir Amilzadeh, who's my colleague at Oxford, and as well as a few that are at the PCAOB. And I myself stepped down as Chief Economist and Director of the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis at the PCAOB at the beginning of this month. But notwithstanding, irrespective of the current or past affiliations, this work is not necessarily the view of the PCAOB board or any board member or any staff member, but if anything, presents views of the authors and the authors alone. So with that disclaimer in place, the reason I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak to you is because the theoretical idea at the core of this paper is important for how to set up an audit regulator. So no matter in which country you are or which country you're in or work in, I think there are some deep principles that are shared across countries, which is what the market friction is that justifies government intervention into the market for audit services, and also what the optimal intervention should ideally be. Not in all countries can that intervention be done the way that economists would like them to be, but that's why we're doing this work, to try and inform how to set up an audit regulator and which constraints to put the regulator under or not. So the title of this paper is Market-Based Incentives for Optimal Audit Quality, and I look forward to hearing your comments later during this talk. So there are three policy questions. You might be aware that right now, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that is going through the various chambers of the United States features changes to how the PCAOB is set up. The original impetus for the PCAOB was the market failures, well, the failures, I should say, of Enron and WorldCom, and the failure of the auditors to find these or even prevent these problematic accounting practices that were at the heart of that crisis. Since then, there have been changes to other national or discussions about changes to other national audit regulators, for example, in Germany after the Wirecard scandal. Now, as part of that debate, people ask whether there's any evidence the PCAOB has ever done anything that matters to investors. And I think we'll speak to that question a little bit. There's a particular question about whether investors care about engagement level information, right? So many audit regulators in the world put reports out that speak to audit firm level average quality metrics or whatnot, but not necessarily about any particular engagements with a particular issuer. The reason that's an important policy question is because last year the PCAOB proposed a new rule according to which the audit firms would have been compelled to make engagement level information available. And one of the key questions there was whether investors even care about that information. So this paper speaks to that question as well. A very much more narrow question is whether the PCAOB and other audit regulators should reveal the issuer names in their inspection reports. So in the US, the current practice is that the PCAOB inspects audits of various issuers and then writes reports about what they saw during these audits, but they average that across the different engagements of a given audit firm. And there's been a long-standing debate literally since the inception of the PCAOB whether they should name the particular issuers instead. And I see that Felix Niggemann is in the audience. Felix, well, two Niggemanns, let's say, and Volkes have a theoretical paper that approaches that question as well, though through a very different mechanism. All right, so there's 3 policy questions, and I think all of which will have a little bit of something to say on the margin with the empirical work that we do there. But before I get there, I want to jot down informally, without math, how I think about the theory of audit regulation. So let me start here. So if it were true that asset prices, so individual issuers' equity prices, reflected audit quality, so the extent to which, and what I mean by that is the shareholder value maximizing level of audit quality. So that can be a multidimensional object that the auditor checks just precisely what equates marginal cost with marginal revenue across various dimensions. Then, of course, investors would demand the optimal level of auditor effort or audit quality at the issuer level. If that is so, then presumably the audit committees of the board of the issuers would have an incentive to contract and monitor for that optimal level of audit quality. And that would lead the auditors to have some incentives, at least, to provide the optimal quality audits, as opposed to providing just the minimal effort level or quality level that meets regulatory constraints, or that doesn't even meet that, but that optimizes some trade-off between getting caught or not, right? So the reason we care about audit quality is, of course, because if audit quality is at the optimal level, that also leads the issuer's CFO or management to set the financial reporting quality at the optimal level, which would enable higher efficiency of asset prices and optimal allocation of resources in the economy and so forth. Now, again, if that was all the case, then arguably one might imagine that one would also need fewer behavioral prescriptions by audit regulators. So what I mean by that is explaining to the auditor precisely what they should do and how to do their job in some ways, right? So how to verify a bank account or whatnot, and then enforcement of these behavioral prescriptions in-house. Because of course, if the auditor would have the right incentives in the first place, then one wouldn't have to prescribe the behavior, no? They would, by virtue of the incentives, do the optimal thing, right? Now, that's all a shiny word. I said a lot of conditional statements. That is because for asset prices to reflect information, investors need that information in the first place. And arguably, investors do not have all the information one could imagine for optimal audit quality. So asset prices will not reflect audit quality when the investors cannot assess the relevant information about what the auditor actually did, right? So if you don't know whether the auditor actually checked the bank account or not, that makes it very hard to price the stock. So what you'll then get is that incentive problems and a lack of authority that prevent individual investors from obtaining that information on auditor efforts, right? So you could imagine that one investor says, I really want to know whether EY checked the Wirecard bank accounts, right? But then, of course, if one investor does that and gets the board to ask the auditor and the auditor reports it back to the board lets all the shareholders know, then because of Reg FD, so fair disclosure rules, all the shareholders would learn about it at the same time. So one shareholder would take all the effort to get the information, but all the other shareholders benefit. So there is a market failure. There's a friction at the heart of this that prevents individual shareholders from obtaining that information. And I think this is the reason why there is scope for a regulator. Right? So why is there scope for a regulator? Why does the market not fix its own market failures? It is because of that free rider problem, among other reasons. But if you had a regulator that pools resources from all the investors, as is the case of the PCAOB, then inspects the audits and then makes the information available to all the investors, that would help the market regulate itself effectively. Now, what prevents that from happening, among other things, is that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act limits quite severely how much information the PCAOB in the US can make available to investors about the audits that they inspected, right? So the inspection information, that's regulation. So that's section 105(b)(5) in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that limits the disclosure of information. So one cannot get to this theoretical extreme simply due to how the law is written. And the reason I'm starting this talk with that is because, again, we have an international audience there. If you're concerned with thinking about how do I optimally set up an audit regulator, then this is to me the key question to think about. How much do you want to restrict or not restrict? To which extent the audit regulator actually can make that information available to the market? That strikes me as the most important question. Right? So, and I mentioned that the PCAOB does make inspections reports available at the audit firm level, but not at the issuer level. So my FDA analogy, the Food and Drug Administration, would be the FDA goes and tests restaurants and says, hey, we find that half of the restaurants in your town have horrible hygiene standards, and you'll probably get sick if you go eat there, but I'm not going to tell you which restaurant it is. No? I mean, that just makes you not want to go to any restaurant, right? So that pools all the restaurants in one basket, as opposed to giving restaurants an incentive to be clean and hence to be able to show to their clients, hey, here you can eat safely without getting sick the next day. No? So that's the analogy that I find useful in that context. And I mentioned the ongoing rule project as well. So now with that long introduction, I'll go to the point of the paper. The paper tests the premise of this theory, namely the premise that investors actually care about issuer level information, right? And hence, it also tests the premise of key opposition to the notion of naming issuers. The key opposition so far is the idea that if the audit regulator made the information available about what they saw in the audit, namely naming the issuer, this was an audit that passed inspection, the other one did not, that the stock market would basically crash, or that would lead to severe drops in stock market values. And this is something that's an empirical hypothesis we can test. So specifically what we test is whether asset prices reflect audit quality, or to which extent they do. So to be precise, audit quality I here mean as reflected in violations of audit standards, right? Of course, there's a sub-question as to whether the audit standards are actually valued by investors, and that we'll see as well. The sub-question is whether these market reactions, these asset price reactions, depend on whether investors can infer which issuer the audit refers to, whether it's a deficient or non-deficient audit. And secondly, whether asset prices drop when issuers can be inferred, right? So that is the opposition to naming issuers. Do they actually drop? That would be in contradiction to the most straightforward financial economics theory, according to which you would expect asset prices to increase when issuers can't be inferred because you're removing asymmetric information discounts from the stock market. And that answering this question informs the policy questions I mentioned. So the preview of the answer is that asset prices in general do not reflect audit quality as proxied by inspections results, which implies a need for behavioral prescriptions amid significant audit failures, as I mentioned previously. Right? Because if asset prices perfectly reflected audit quality, then those wouldn't be needed, or would have less of a need anyways. Okay, now does that depend on whether investors can infer which issuer the audit refers to? And the answer is yes. Okay, so you can see that asset prices do move, so they somewhat reflect audit quality when investors know which audit is deficient and which one was not found to be deficient anyways. Okay, third, do asset prices drop when the issuers can be inferred? And the answer is no, at least we cannot find any significant negative returns of overall asset prices when this information is available. In fact, there is some evidence of positive returns. Now, what we do to answer these questions is to collect data on the release of these public inspection reports by the PCAOB, and then study issuer-level stock market reactions to that information release, whereas we split the sample by whether the market can infer the identity of the issuer or whether the market cannot infer that. And so in terms of summary stats, 35% of the timing in audit analytics we find by doing this work is actually off by as much as 100 days. Only about half are correct within one trading date or not. And we let audit analytics know. But for anybody here in the audience who is doing research with that data, you should be aware of that, that the data needs some fixing there as well. Second, the second finding is that PCAOB inspections are somewhat identifiable. That is, for a very small fraction of the audits, namely a fraction of the triennially inspected issuers. So that's about 5.8% of the issuers, because they relate to an inspection report that refers to an auditor that has 3 or fewer issuers, right? So what's the idea here? The idea is that when you have an auditor that only has one public client, and the PCAOB says, well, this auditor had a 100% deficiency rate or a 0% deficiency rate, then of course investors can find out whether which particular issuer belongs to that, because there's a one-to-one match between audit firms and issuers, right? Now, for the rest of the inspections reports, of course, linking individual clients to that report is difficult for the rest of these reports. And therefore, one would expect that the market reactions are more difficult. So the main results then are that the non-identifiable issuers, so those where the market cannot easily infer who the issuer is, do not exhibit differences in market reactions across audits that were found to be deficient versus those that were not found to be deficient. And that's what supports the statement I made that asset prices in general do not reflect audit quality when investors lack information. And there's going to be a caveat to that I'll mention shortly. Second, the identifiable issuers that are audited by triennial auditors with 1 to 3 clients, they do display significant differences in stock returns in the days surrounding the information release. So what does it mean? I mean, I think first it means that investors do care about engagement level information. And second, asset prices do reflect audit quality, at least more, when the investors do have that information. Now, the third main finding is that the identifiable non-deficient issuers gain about 1.3% in returns relative to the market, while the identifiable deficient issuers have about 1.1% negative return, but it's not significant in most specifications. But the difference is statistically significant, as I'll show you in some more detail. So it's not that we see that on average across issuers, when one makes information available, the stock market starts to tank, or that this depresses stock prices is transparency. So that's what I think of as the main results. I mentioned there's got a few caveats to that. I'll start with the first one here. So when I say asset prices do not reflect audit quality, of course, that refers to an additional piece of information about audit quality that comes out. Of course, it could be that asset prices have reflected that information already in some sort of strong form efficiency already. So that's a first caveat. The second caveat is external validity. So I mentioned that the identifiable issuers and audit firms, they're a very small fraction of the overall sample. But not only that, they're also observably different from non-identifiable ones. So in particular, these issuers tend to be very small and the audit firms tend to be very small. So it's unclear in how far one should extrapolate from these findings to what would happen if inspections reports named issuers also for larger issuers and larger audit firms. So that's not really something we can speak to. The second caveat, or the third caveat really, is internal validity, right? So the assignment between issuer and auditor, that's endogenous, right? So we don't have random assignment there either. And therefore, one should not think of these as causal effects. Now, I'd say there's also a caveat to the caveat, which is as follows, right? So one of the research questions we address is whether the stock markets tank, for if one makes this information available. Now, I would think that this concern is larger for smaller issuers than for, I don't know, Apple or something, right? So you would not expect that Apple stock price crashes because there's a lot of substitute sources of information in addition to the auditor's report. So I would think that if these results hold within this sample that we see here, they're perhaps or arguably more likely to hold outside that sample as well. Another caveat or there's nuance to these results is that the information we use here is quite crude, right? So it's a binary 1-0 deficient or not deficient description of the audit. But of course, one could think theoretically of making more granular information available to the market. Again, in the US, the audit regulator cannot just dump everything they saw during the inspection to the market. But maybe in other countries they can, or maybe in the future, regulators will be able to do that, right? So that is just a bit of context to think about these results. And I'm hoping that each of you is starting to think about alternatives, such as, a 5-star rating for the audit or whatever it might be that would be more granular information that regulators could make available to the market. Right. So anyways, a long list of caveats. You might walk out of the seminar and say, oh, but then you're not really saying very much about the research question, and I will not fight with you about this. I just say that's as much as one can say about the research questions that there are, given today's level of information. And I think it's just a very important question. Okay, I'll skip over that slide in the interest of time. I mentioned the Attar, Nigeman, and Lokes paper previously. I'll just explain how the theory that I just sketched out relates to Attar, Nigeman, and Lokes. So in their paper, the channel is that if an audit regulator made issuer level information available, that would potentially make it easier for investors to sue an auditor if something went wrong. No? And that, of course, has incentives effect as well. Whereas the channel that I informally argued here in our paper is through asset prices. No? And of course, these are complementary, so there's no competition between these different channels. I just wanted to clarify that difference. All right, I'll skip over the rest of the literature and instead explain what we do. But maybe that's also a good time to take any questions in case you have any. Do I see anybody with an urgent question? Mohammed?
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
Jacob.
has a question.
So first and most, thank you for a very interesting presentation so far. So maybe again, feel free to sort of correct if I misunderstood. But sort of your point here is really to make the distinction that okay, so you have a company, the company is being audited. You now look at the regulatory investigation into the audit, and that's quality. Because you could also argue that the primary mechanism that really do matter is the audit itself. I mean, if you take one very famous example, the auditors for Credit Suisse coming out and saying there were material deficiencies really were. I mean, there were a lot of problems there, but that was the thing that started the final bank run that really sort of closed business for them. And there are multiple examples where auditors saying, okay, things are too bad, we cannot sort of underwrite this, leads to basically the market sort of correcting itself. So you could argue that from a regulator point of view, it's not necessarily that important that the market react to a specific audit being deficient, but the regulator sort of policing that general audit quality is high because what the auditors publicly display do really matter. Do you a little bit see the point I'm coming at?
Yeah, so let me paraphrase and see if I do understand your point.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, well, the audit itself absent the regulator checking on whether the rules were kept itself already has an effect on stock prices.
Yeah, I would argue that is the most important effect. And I'm saying as a practitioner in the industry, but that is, you know, the key effect. And the regulator is more just to make sure that that machinery is working, sort of.
So look, I mostly very much agree, and I think you said it. I'll say it again in different words that presumably, you know, if there was no regulator in the background, then the question is how much weight would investors put on that auditor report? So perhaps the reason they put so much weight on the auditor report is knowing that there's a regulator in the background. No?
Exactly, and I think that is a really good point, because that's my point is more that, you know, if you say, okay, we see very little, you know, for example, indication on asset quality from what the regulator do, the point is more to say, okay, but the fact that investors can trust the audit is because, you know, that, you know, the audit firm is under pressure to, you know, if they sort of have a too low quality, they will, you know, potentially lose their ability to do sort of auditing.
Exactly,
I mean, if you take the famous example, you know, Arthur Andersen, you know, if your quality sinks too low, eventually, you know, you're gonna be shut down.
Yeah. So look, I don't think I think that's not wrong, and in some ways, if improving further what the audit regulator is doing in order to make the audit even more credible, if that's all we do, that's kind of like good enough. People always ask me, why, Martin, why would you have taken a break from a cushy job in Oxford and gonna play an audit regulator? And one part of the answer always involves because these audit rules affect $70 trillion of equity market cap, no?
Yeah.
So, and $70 trillion, if disclosure matters at all for the level of asset prices, no, making it even just a little bit better. I always say if we made this 0.1% better, that's 7 billion right there. That's more value than I'll create by writing an additional referee.
But that is sort of my point. I mean, the audit regulators really, I mean, I'm fairly believing that it has a big sort of quality impact, but that the quality impact comes through the indirect channel of basically policing the regulator. I mean, I work in a bank.
Absolutely, yeah.
I can say as a risk control specialist there that, you know, the fact that you have regulators often is the thing that empowers you on the inside to be able to say, guys, you know, I need X million to invest it in this. And it would have been much harder to, even though the rationale itself is very sound, it would have been much harder to push for that if there weren't a regulator banging on the door saying you have to do this.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with that as well. So again, if this is like all just like building the support system, making sure there's no cracks in the foundation, that is sufficient motivation for me. I mean, Jakob, you should probably send a letter to a bunch of US senators or something to let them know that you actually think.
Now I mean, I of course didn't sit in a EU domain, so they're
very good.
We're quite happy, but super interesting. Thank you so much for the answer.
That's cool. So I don't see additional hands, so I'll just keep moving on. Let me go back and try and share again what we have. Hopefully you can see my slides again. I don't see anybody nodding, but also don't hear protests. Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right. So the data mainly consists of audit analytics, and I already spoke a little bit about that. But then we also hand collected inspection report states, right? So that's public information, right? I mean, the PCAOB sends out these news blasts whenever these reports come out. So when that happened, I mean, the internet knows that, yeah. Then, of course, there's crisp stock returns and compass debt accounting data and standard finance risk factors to control for the usual, returns in some of the regressions. Now, again, the results are super, look at a particular subset of the issuer population. And what we try to do is essentially matching what investors can do by themselves. So you try to match each inspection report or with each inspection report of the PCAOB with the audit opinions in audit analytics and include all issuers that use the inspected firm, so the inspected audit firm, in the year before the report's publication date, actually regardless of whether that issuer's audit was inspected by the PCAOB, because the market doesn't necessarily know that, right? Or is not supposed to know that anyways. Okay, so you start with 3,500 inspection reports. After merging with Audit Analytics, CRISP and Compostat, there's 1,500 left. Then we restrict the focus on these triennial audit firms. So those inspected once every 3 years. Those are only firms that have less than 100 public clients. So those are fairly small firms, right? Because you don't want to compare an auditor that has one public client with, a big four. So there's a closer comparison if we focus on the triennial firms. And so we end up with 731 inspection reports of 260 unique audit firms, 1,500-ish unique issuers, and 150 distinct report release dates from which we can study. Again, like it's very, very specifically selected. That's just something to keep in mind. So how does it look like? Well, here's this news blast. The PCAOB posts 10 new inspection reports and expanded reports, right? They include large firms, Ernst & Young, KPMG, Taiwan, Kreischer Miller, and so forth, right? Now, here's an important thing to know, which is this blast presents reports that have the stamp June 12th on them, no? But that doesn't mean that this release was actually sent out on June 12th. So investors can only react to it once it was actually sent, and that happened on July 23rd. No? So this is where we think we're making a contribution to having a cleaner dates. Obviously, you can't really run event studies when you don't really know where within 2 weeks and the information was released. Okay, so part one of the design is to figure out what the stamp date is versus when the news blasts were sent, and I just explained that in detail. So there's a difference between these, and we try to get this right. Now, when we compare these public release dates versus what Audit Analytics reports, then only 44%, I mentioned that in the main results, only 44% are even just within a day, plus or minus, of the actual release dates in Audit Analytics. And a whole bunch are off by more than 10 days, like more than a third are off by more than 10 days in one direction or another. So really, you can't do proper event studies using Audit Analytics on that information. So hopefully we made some contribution there. So part two, of course, requires knowing which inspection report effectively identifies an issuer. And look, if you look at this audit firm or another, and you find out that this firm only had one issuer client, and the PCAOB reviewed one client, then you immediately know who the issuer is without any guessing. No? So one of the firms has a 0% deficiency rate. In other words, the one audit that was inspected was not found to be deficient, and this particular audit was found to be deficient, right? So that's kind of trivial then to guess. Here's a counterexample. Here's a different firm that has 50 total issuers, of which the PCAOB reviewed 5. Okay. Well, and here they have a deficiency rate of 60%. So 3 out of 5 were found to be deficient. But here's another one that has 6 audited clients. One audit was reviewed, has a 0% deficiency rate, right? So here it is not clear which of these 6 audits it actually was. No? So what is the stock market supposed to do with it? And basically the finding is the stock market doesn't do much with that, or anyway, it's not something we can measure. No? That's the key idea. All right. I'll skip over the observations per year. That's not super interesting. But what I did mention is that about 6% only of all the issuers are identifiable, but that doesn't differ a ton by year. So I mentioned that the non-identifiable issuers are quite different from the identifiable ones, mostly by size, right? So the market cap of the identifiable issuers is very, very small. And of the non-identifiable ones in the sample, it's just very small. No? So we're comparing very small issuers with other small issuers. No? And other than that, they're fairly similar, but the size, they differ quite a bit. That's the difference in means down there. Okay, now here's the first main result. The main result is, what is the market response to the release of inspections reports for those public issuers that we call non-identifiable? So those are issuers that were audited by an auditor that has more than 3 public clients. No, then we say, hey, the issuer doesn't really know. Well, and what do you expect? I mean, again, you expect nothing because what are you gonna? You don't know. No, you can't really react to it because you don't know who the issuer was. And if you carefully look, there's no stars in this table. So nothing happens is the point, no? So we can't identify a market reaction, whether the audit was deficient or non-deficient. The T-stats are basically 0. And that doesn't matter whether you use just market adjustments to the issuer stock return or a pharma French 3-factor adjustment. There's just no market reaction. So that's finding number 1. In general, audit issuer stock prices don't reflect audit information, again, with lots of caveats. That's for the subsample. We just don't find a reaction, and so forth. So now you could think, well, maybe stock prices of these firms are just noisy. That's why you don't observe a reaction. Or you could think, well, maybe investors just don't care at all about what the PCAOB does. No, you say, well, maybe they care about what the PCAOB does, but these inspection reports, they're just not informative about anything. Hence, there's a next table which shows the market response to inspection reports of the identifiable issuers. Okay, and in bold face and with stars, what do we see? That for auditors whose audit was not found to be deficient, there is not really a market reaction, not a measurable market reaction in the first day, but over 2 days you get a star. Whereas for the deficient ones, you get 2 stars in this specification, but not in that. So I'm not going to call that a strong result. But, directionally it is negative here. Directionally it's positive here. Okay. And again, the T-stat of the difference between the deficient versus non-deficient firms, that T-stat is significantly positive, right? So the market does put a wedge between the deficient and non-deficient firms when it can identify it. And now that finding, is a bit stronger in the market adjustments than with the pharma French adjustment. And look, you judge yourself. I'm not going to sell this as to how strong or not strong that is. My personal opinion is this table looks different from the previous table where, there's absolutely nothing. And here's, let's say, maybe something. No? So what I take away from that is that when issuers are identifiable, then the market does react positively to non-deficient audits and negatively to deficient ones, though how strongly significant that is, that I leave to you. No? Now, economically speaking, that gap is quite large. No? So compared to how stock prices react to regulatory penalties and so forth, I think these results are quite big. Now I'm going to do something that comes with a lot of caveats. No? I previously said there's not really a lot of reasons, empirically speaking, that these results would be externally valid. And I gave you lots of reasons to think that Apple's stock price reaction would be very, very different from these very small firms' reactions. But let's do the calculation anyways and say, look, a 1% drop in Apple's stock price, that's like $30 billion, no? So that's just orders of magnitude, like literally 3 orders of magnitude higher than any regulatory penalty for an audit failure that an audit regulator could ever dole out. No? And the reason I think that matters is just it illustrates the potential impact that harnessing market forces could have. No? So if, again, imagine, you shouldn't think that's realistic because there's other substitutes to audits for Apple stock price. But if Apple was revealed to have a deficient audit, the stock price drops by 1%. That's a $30 billion value destruction. Presumably, some shareholders would give the board a call and tell them to please make sure that the next audit is not deficient and is of higher quality. No? And so this chain of economic incentives would trickle through. It's 30 billion reasons to care about the audit as opposed to a few million for audit failures. The next result is, I'll skip over that, just not to confuse you. Now, I'm almost through with the results. What we do here is to split between the identifiable issuers and the non-identifiable issuers just over time. Okay. And what you see is and cumulative abnormal return. So what you see is that in the 10 days before, nothing much happened, some ups and downs. Now, if it was true that having identifiable audit reports would make the stock prices crash, then you would expect this gray line here to just like fall through the floor at the event date, but you don't see that. No? So that's what I mean by in the main results by saying, if anything, you see a positive reaction, but there's definitely not something like a stock market crash when the market learns about identifiable issuers. Okay. Now, for the deficient ones, the market goes kind of down or flat, and for the non-deficient one, perhaps it goes a bit up. But the main point again is the stock market does not crash. There's no harm to overall stock market performance from identifiability. All right, so I'll skip over the cumulative abnormal returns as well, so we have some time for questions. I'll skip over some robustness tests and just go to a conclusion. I think what we see empirically is that PCAOB inspection reports have a measurable immediate impact on the valuation of issuers in the financial market, but only when the issuers are effectively identifiable in the inspection report and not otherwise. No? Now, directionally, these results go in the right direction in the sense that investors seem to value a non-deficient report. They seem to not like a deficient report. But the statistically significant result is really by taking the difference between the deficient and the non-deficient firms. Now, going back to the theory, the reason these results are important, I think, is because there's a cross-subsidization here. So all issuers, in particular those that demanded a high-quality audit from the auditor, they pay for this cost of intransparency by effectively having a lower stock price, by being pooled by the other firms. You cannot signal your quality by asking your auditor to do a particularly good job, because the market doesn't see that the job was particularly good in almost all of the cases. No? And of course, that gives you a disincentive to really care as an issuer about the quality of your audit. And that gives you a disincentive to ask for one, that gives a disincentive to the auditor to provide one. No? Again, of course, there's like lots of caveats to these statements because it's well known that if you switch from a Big Four auditor to another one, that there's a stock market punishment and all these good things. But you get the idea that this is really about textbook adverse selection, makes economists sad, and the solution to that is more transparency. Second main result, the suggestion here is that there's a potential to reduce firms' average cost of capital and lifting stock prices by removing that adverse selection discount that is associated with uncertainty about audit quality. The policy implications, I think, are that for regulators, it is very important to carefully think about this question about whether greater transparency of these inspections reports would be warranted. Again, the PCAOB is in a special place right now politically. It is in a special place legally. But of course, this question matters for international regulators as well, that are thinking about how to set up an audit regulator or how to overhaul it and what kind of constraints to put that regulator under. Oh. So, right, there's more ideas, which is that given that nearly all annually inspected auditors have some form of deficiency, it seems that those issuers that did not have a deficient audit, so that had a good audit, that's the majority of issuers, might want to actually advocate for transparency about their report. No? So if, again, my stereotypical Apple, that's of course not an internally informed name, I'm just making this up, right? If Apple went like, hey, I know I have a non-deficient audit, they should lobby for that or make that information available to the market, and they can't do that, right? So the audit regulator can't do that, but the issuers, they would be free to provide that information. Asset managers would be free, or asset owners would be free to demand that information from the issuers. Proxy advisory firms could demand that information from issuers, right? So it could just be a new governance standard that whenever a auditor is being put up for re-election, that this proxy is being supplied with information about whether the audits were deficient or non-deficient as inspected by the audit regulator. There's no prohibitions to that, no? Now, investors have asked for that information for many years in the investor advisory group at the PCAOB. The Chamber of Commerce has opposed that so far. But again, the ball is really in the court of investors at this point, and then perhaps even securities regulators as well. I also mentioned at the outset that one could think about various thinkable alternatives to just making these inspection reports transparent and say good audit, bad audit. It could be a lot more granular as well. And look, the ball is in your court to be creative and think about alternatives to that system. Excellent. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate your attention, and thank you very much for the invitation, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Professor Martin Schmalz, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation, excellent paper. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, joining us today, and thank you very much, dear Professor Martin, for taking the time to present to us today. It's been appreciated.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah. And I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
Happily. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.